Welcome back. This is part 2 of Anthropological Fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. Again, I will continue to present what I think are crucial, important, compelling, morally difficult issues that all anthropologists confront when they're engaged in fieldwork. This is especially true, as you can tell, when conducting fieldwork in the developing world. You will surely recall from part 1 that I indicated when conducting anthropological fieldwork in a kinship-based society, it's vitally important that the anthropologist be adopted into a family. That is, that the anthropologist be given a particular social role within the broad network of kin. This is my father, Yambukin. He is now deceased. And here is my adoptive mother, Agui, who's mixing a bowl of sago pudding. You'll see some photos of that later on in the presentation. She is under the house, so you get a sense as to how big some of the houses are. The gentleman sitting behind her is another village father, Demoy. Both of them are also now deceased. And here I am with both of them. This is when the anthropologist was much younger, and as my kids say, when the anthropologist had hair. This is the house of another research assistant I've known for now over 20 years. His name is Gambaro Miavan, and this is his house. As you can tell, it's relatively small. It's leaning quite a bit. He needs to rebuild it, but he doesn't actually have the money right now to afford the amount of food that one would have to give to other people in order for them to help him reconstruct the house. And this is the inside of his house. You can see his blue mosquito net. Everybody needs to sleep in a mosquito net because Sepik River mosquitoes are voracious and malarial. To the right in the foreground is a clothesline where he's hung up some of his clothing, and those two masks in the background are touristic masks. That is, he's carved them in the hopes that tourists will come into the village and buy them. There are no longer any tourists, as I'll discuss later on in the presentation, so they're essentially hanging there representing his dreams rather than a sort of reality of cash income. This was my father's house in the late 1980s, and if you look at the man to the lower left, you'll get a sense as to just how big these houses are. I might add that the decoration on the facade of the house represents river waves or water waves, and you can see in the center of the house a face. The house is a woman, and that's her eyes and her nose and mouth. At the corners of the house are earrings. They're hard to see. And she also has two breasts, which are just below the mouth, which you really can't see here. But anyhow, on the one hand, there are men's houses where only men spend time. And then everyday domestic houses are sort of female or maternal spaces. Here's a much smaller house during the rainy season. When the rains come, which kind of corresponds to our winter, the river can rise and flood sometimes as much as 20 feet, transforming the entire region into just a massive river and lake. And the only way to get around then is on canoes, and most people actually have to flee the entire region and resettle on the top of a hill many hours downriver, and they have to stay there for several months until the river waters recede. Another house? And the interior of another house. On the lower left corner you can see a mattress for sleeping. Then you can see that sort of yellow curtain is really a makeshift mosquito net made from fabric, not even real mosquito net. In the foreground you can see the person's clothing and possessions. On the house post, right in the center, in which dwells the traditional house spirit, you can also see pictures of Mary and Jesus. So in this community, people synthesize both their traditional ancestral spirit religious traditions and Christianity. On the right side of the house, you can see pots, pans, other possessions, including the box for a Sony boombox. More mosquito nets. The one on the back of the picture does in fact have a mattress. You'll notice that the person who sleeps in the foreground under that mosquito net does not actually have any mattress to sleep on. Instead, they just sleep on a thin woven mat. And the kitchen area. Here's a couple of more modern style houses, although I believe nobody's living in them right now and they're sort of falling apart. Here's a little boy climbing his own front house ladder. Here you can see the equivalent of child-proofing a home. That is a piece of wood or a plank that goes across the bottom of the door to make sure that kids who are toddlers and especially babies who are crawling don't tumble down the front house ladder. A house that's not yet complete. On the left is my father's house, and on the right is the house that men in the village built for me in the late 1980s. Yes, that's my laundry drying. And the little platform in front of my house that has the colorful plastic dishes and bins is where I would set out my dirty dishes and my dirty laundry. And the women in my extended family would more or less immediately come and pick it up and take it to the river to wash it. Now, interestingly enough, early on in my field work, I once, or not even once, a couple of times I would wash some of the dishes myself. I mean, after all, it's not that far to walk to the river, and I'm fully capable of washing my own dishes. After a couple of weeks, one of my sisters yelled at me in private and basically said, "Stop doing your dishes. You're making us, the women in the family, look bad." So this is a great example of kind of moral issues and culture shock. I thought I was actually helping them out, doing them a favor. After all, I can do my own dishes, but in fact, my good intentions, my good moral intentions, completely backfired, and I ended up making my sisters look bad in the eyes of the community. So it's a nice cautionary tale about just how careful you have to be in doing field work when even sometimes the most simplest gestures can backfire. This was the front room, as it were, the living room and kitchen, shall we say. On the floor, you can see some vinyl floor mat that I laid down in an attempt to keep out snakes. On the ceiling, the reflective stuff is plastic, which I put over the ceiling in order to keep out the seeds and just the stuff that falls down from the thatch all the time. I have mosquito wiring that goes across the windows. On the right-hand side, you can see 3 water containers. In front of them is a small kerosene stove. You can also see a couple of kerosene stoves with pots that are on the little makeshift shelf that has things like instant coffee and powdered milk and a red plastic bin for dishes and some pots and pans. You can also see on the back wall a little camping shower I use so if I just needed water to wash my hands. At the back on the floor are 2 metal patrol boxes that I use to keep out rats from eating my food. On them are some more kerosene lanterns. There's a little table in the center of the room on which you can see some field notes and some mosquito spray. It was actually quite comfortable. I'm very fond of this house. I like to think of it as my first home. In the back room, the bedroom as it were, that's my bed inside my mosquito wire, and there you can see a table, and on the table is something that I find most students have never seen, never mind used, a manual typewriter. And this was my latrine. The top right is my house in the village as it existed from 1988 to 1990. The bigger photo shows the exact same shot in 2010. The house had long been taken down. It basically fell down, and you can see how much the larger house on the left has aged. Now, if you can make out in the middle of the photo, the large photo, just on the right, you can see a sliver of the river. The river constantly erodes ground. When I went back last year, that is in 2014, all that ground in front of you had been completely eroded, and that large house was taken down because it was basically ready to tumble into the water. Just gives you a sense as to the dramatic change that that river, which constantly flows, does to the landscape. The sort of human life is very much kind of building up the land and building up social life against the constant erosion of the river. And there's a photo from 2010. When I was in the village in the late 1980s, I would be standing literally inside somebody's home. Right at that point, however, the river had completely eroded the ground. I'm now in a canoe. When I went back in 2014, that house in front of you and that little platform where all those kids are sitting, that had completely gone. It had all just been eaten essentially by the river. When I went back to the village in 2010, I stayed in the small dwelling on the right. That's a trade store, or what was a trade store owned by my brother. This was just a small shop that sold, some rice and some canned food and batteries, just a couple of small things. But now it's completely discontinued. And so I slept in there, and my brother and his family slept on the larger house to the left. And here's a couple of photos of the inside of that particular ex-trade store. You can see the mosquito-wired bed on the bottom. On the top is sort of the front room, and on the right is just some shelves where I stored some things. And there's my latrine in the village today. This is my brother's house in 2014, and I had a little room on the side, as you'll see in just a minute. And here was my room in 2014 in the same house. Obviously, if you truly want to understand another culture, you have to adapt to their everyday routines, and this means eating the same food that they eat. For example, fish, in this case caught by a little boy. My sister on the right and some of her kin cleaning fish. And a group of women in the river cleaning fish. And one of my brother's wives cooking fish. One of my sisters again on the right smoking fish. What they're going to do is take several sacks of fish and bring it to the town of Wewak in order to sell it in the market. A plate of small eels, crocodile, fried bananas for breakfast. They are actually enormously tasty. An impromptu market. In the foreground is a canoe from another community that came one day to the village of Tambanum, where I'm spending time, bringing sugar cane. That's the long thing that the boy with no shirt is holding in the foreground. They also have betel nuts and sweet potato and fruits and vegetables and yams, and these sorts of markets happen all the time, usually for the equivalent of a couple of pennies, some nickels, a few dimes per item. In 2014, on every Saturday morning, women would hold a small market across the river from the main village. They would line the main path with tarps, and on it each woman would put some of her products, which were usually small household items or small food items. I think in this photo you can see biscuits, which are basically crackers, and some batteries and cans of tuna, and it looks like there's some bags of rice and some matches and some detergent and maybe some tea and sugar and just minor things like this. Again, it's an example of the informal economy. You don't make a lot of money doing this. You probably profit pennies from each item. You certainly don't gain the kind of wealth that you would like to gain in order to quote unquote develop into sort of a middle class lifestyle. For the tens of thousands of people in Papua New Guinea who are entirely dependent on the Sepik River for their livelihood, the river is the only regular source of water. There is no plumbing, that is, no municipal water available anywhere in the region. And this is what the river water looks like. Now, local people know that the river has parasites and it's dirty. They know that they get ill from it, but they simply don't have access to the infrastructure. There's no infrastructural development in the region that would provide them with, say, the kind of clean municipal water we have. So it's another example of global inequality. Traditionally, most people everywhere subsisted off of a staple food, a staple starch in particular. In some places it's rice, in some places it's wheat. In many places in the Pacific Islands and island Southeast Asia, the staple starch food is called sago. Sago is prepared from a sago palm. This is a small group of tourists traveling up a stream, and they're surrounded by swampy sago palms. Here's two more sago palms. Now, in order to produce the actual starch, you have to chop down the palm tree. Then you basically split the trunk of the palm tree in half, and you chop out the pith. That is the inside of the tree. That's what a man is doing here. He's got a pounder, and he's just pounding away at the pith of the palm tree. Here's a couple of kids doing the same by the edge of the river. I should indicate that this particular village is 4 degrees below the equator. So essentially we're on the equator in the tropics. It is very difficult for us folks in New England to imagine both the intensity of the sun, the heat, and the humidity. This is hard work. This is not like going to Stop and Shop and buying groceries. These are food producers. If you want to eat, you need to produce your food. It is very hard work, and the local community, everybody in it, is well aware of the ease and convenience of affluent people who earn a paycheck and go into a store and buy food, and they aspire to that level of affluence. They recognize that when they don't have money, they can prepare their food, but it's not exactly what they want to do, any more than you or I want to go back in time and be food preparers as well, or food producers as well. In general, men are the ones who chop down the tree and also, chop up the pith in the inside of it. Then women take over, and what women do is they gather up the chopped up pith. It kind of looks like sawdust, basically, and they put it in this kind of apparatus of troughs and screens, and they wash it with river water. And then what happens is the starch leaches out of the pith and settles in the settles in the basket at the bottom of the screen in the canoe, and then it dries out. And this is what raw sago looks like. It basically is sort of like crumbly sawdust. And women do all the cooking in the community. So what they do is they take some of the raw sago starch and they fry it up like a pancake or a sort of gelatinous piece of pita bread. And here's a piece of fried sago and a piece of smoked fish. Sago, when it's fried, tastes completely bland. It's like pita bread that's thick, maybe a 1/4 inch thick, and it's sort of gelatinous. So if you can imagine a piece of gelatinous pita bread that you have to chew for a while in order to kind of break it down, that's bland, and then you get a kind of a general sense as to what it tastes like. The other way to prepare sago is to drop handfuls of it into boiling water. In this way it forms a kind of glutinous, gelatinous jelly or pudding. So on this plate you have a piece of boiled fish was surrounded by a couple of greens, and the fish is right on 3 kind of reddish globs of sago jelly. Each glob is stuck together in this kind of gelatinous mess, and so you can't really break it apart. What you sort of do is scoop the whole glob out with your hand, or kind of put your lips up to the plate and suck the whole thing down. It's kind of gross, if you pardon my ethnocentric commentary here. I frankly didn't like it very much, but this is what you're looking at right here is sort of a standard, typical Sepik meal. And here you can see somebody trying to kind of pull out some of this sago jelly. Onto something a bit more tasty, at least from my perspective. On the bottom are small bananas that have been roasted in a fire, and on the top are bananas that have been boiled in coconut milk. We folks who live in industrialized countries in the West, we do an interesting things every now and then when we're on vacation. We go camping. That is to say, we leave quote-unquote civilization and all its conveniences and go spend a couple of days in the woods getting quote-unquote back to nature. This is my brother's wife. She doesn't need to go camping. She doesn't need to go back to nature. She's part of it. She cooks her tea or hot water on an outdoor fire all the time. She has no choice, no alternative. Is this good? Is this bad? Why do we have the conveniences we do and she doesn't? What is the legacy of colonialism in history? This is an important issue that you have to think about when you're doing anthropology in the developing world. What is your responsibility as the anthropologist to colonialism and to history? Another important issue is to avoid romanticizing other people. You could present my Sepik River, my Yatmal friends as somehow living at one with nature, a kind of Disney version of tribal people. But that would be absolutely false. They're not living our romantic lives. They're living their own lives. At the same time, you could present them as wholly, entirely tragic victims. But that would be unfair too. They're not just tragic victims. They also love, they laugh, they enjoy their life, they create meaning, they do all the things we do. So how do you accurately present the full humanity of another culture? How do you present them as they really are? Not through our own cultural lenses, but how do you present the totality of their life in its actuality? It's an enormously difficult question, but one that you absolutely need to think about when you're doing anthropology. The people who live along the Sepik River also eat mayflies. Mayflies live in the mud at the bottom of the river, and then depending upon the phases of the moon, which I don't understand precisely, they come out of the muck of the river in a sort of cloud, millions and millions of them, and they have a very intense life of about 1 or 2 hours. They mate and die, basically. And while they're flying around, the people who live on the river go out in their canoes and they scoop them up in nets, as my brother's wife is doing here, by the thousands and millions, and then they eat them. They basically look like, I don't know, a cross between a moth and a butterfly. This is what one actually looks like. And here's a basket of fresh mayflies just scooped up from the river. And a sandwich. Freshly fried mayflies in sago bread. I'll be perfectly honest. I thought they were gross. They kind of smelled, they weren't very tasty, they were kind of crunchy. Frankly speaking, I prefer to eat other things. But when you're living in the Sepik, you eat what everybody else does. People in Papua New Guinea also dine on sago grubs. This is the larva of a sago beetle. And here is a market where a woman is selling basically grubs. You can either eat them raw, you just pop them in your mouth, or you can skewer them and smoke them over a fire and eat them that way. Fresh bananas cut from the tree. When I go to the village, I buy in town lots and lots of rice and lots of cans of fish, in particular tuna. What they have in Papua New Guinea is they have cans of tuna fish, big cans of tuna fish that's pre-mixed with curry sauce, tomato sauce, and so this ketchup, chili sauce, and so this is a can of tuna in curry, which is dumped on some rice. A young kid eating the seeds off of a plant. If you're thirsty for coconut water, somebody has to scramble up a palm tree to get some coconuts, usually a young boy. Here he is, about halfway up the tree. And up. And up. You can't see him, but that little boy is up in the top of the tree in the center. If you look all the way down, you can see the coconuts that he's shaken out of the tree. Each of those coconuts is about the size of a basketball and pretty heavy, so that gives you a sense as to just how tall those trees are he just climbed. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of selecting carefully your informants. That is, people who represent a broad and relevant spectrum of views that will help you understand the culture. On the right is Demoyavan, now deceased, who was a member of the Fish Clan, standing next to one of his spirit costumes. He was one of the men I worked with very carefully in the late 1980s. On the left is Gambaro Miyavan, standing next to a spirit face carved into a house post. He's still alive, and I've been working with him closely for the past 20 years, although his wife died a few years ago, and he remains deeply bereaved. Doing anthropology in a different culture is a lot like becoming a child again. You arrive in a society or culture about which you know basically very little. And what you're essentially doing is becoming a kid again. You have to be re-socialized. You have to learn entirely anew a completely different culture. Here you see a father bringing his young son to the spirits for the first time. When he does that, the father gives a coconut or some food to the elder men, and the men, acting on behalf of the spirits, smear black paint on the young boy's face. The color black connotes power and spiritual essence, and this is a way of transmitting the potency of the spirits to the young boy so that he will someday grow to be big and knowledgeable and strong. And here is the anthropologist in 1989. Yes, having gone through the rite of passage of being formally introduced to the spirits for the first time, and like a little boy, he also has black paint smeared on his face. Doing anthropology is re-socialization. You relearn a new culture. You need to relearn what it is to be a moral person. When doing fieldwork, you need to make certain that you're spending enough time with all the relevant categories of people so that you have a good understanding of the entire culture. In Papua New Guinea, men and women generally, traditionally, lead very different lives. They don't interact that much. I could have spent all my time with the men. It would have seemed perfectly natural since me as a male was naturally spending time with men. I needed, however, to make certain that I also spent time with women, even if it was awkward. Awkward in the sense that in order for me to spend time studying women, speaking to women, learning about women, I had to violate the cultural norm, which is that men do their thing and women do their thing. So in a sense, in order to learn what it's like to be a normal Yatmul person, I had to violate the norms of everyday behavior, and that's a fine line that you have to tread. A mother washing dishes while her child bathes. How do you grapple with social conventions that violate your own sensibilities about what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior? My sense is that most Americans who went to Papua New Guinea would find the norms of male and female behavior to be somewhat shocking. On the one hand, men do in fact have a lot of opportunity to laze around the men's house, chatting, smoking, hanging out, talking, preparing for ritual. On the other hand, women bear the burden of most everyday toil and labor. Cooking, washing dishes, washing clothing, taking care of kids, and so on and so forth. Do you intervene? We've talked about this in an earlier image. Do you not intervene? How do you balance your own moral convictions with respect for another culture? This is a crucial issue. How do you balance your own moral convictions with the necessity of respecting another culture? How do you respect another culture but remain true to your own sense of self? Very important question. Here you see a woman in a tropical downpour. She has just given birth the previous day. In Yatmul culture, Women's bodily secretions, menstrual blood, birthing fluids, are all said by men to be deeply polluting. If a man comes into contact with menstrual blood, for example, he gets sick, he gets shortness of breath, his muscles atrophy, he ages quickly, his gardens wilt, he'll be defeated in a fight, and so forth. This isn't to say that men don't enjoy spending occasionally time with women. It's not to say that men don't enjoy sex with women in this community. They do. But men have to balance contact with women and especially avoid women's bodily substances. They have to balance that with spending time by themselves, men by themselves, in the men's house. When a woman gives birth in this community, she's not allowed for 5 days to go in and out of her house through the front or back door. Why? Because some of her birthing secretions might drip on the threshold, and if a man steps over it, his body will become polluted. Instead, the woman, who has just given birth, has to go in and out of her house through a ladder into the window, and that's what you're seeing in this slide here. How do you remain true to your own sense of self, to your own sense of right and wrong and ethics, to your own sense about how the world should be, and yet still respect another culture? When you're doing ethnography in another society, you're constantly running up against these sorts of ethical dilemmas. You want to respect the other culture, but that doesn't mean you need to accept everything they do. So how do you respect their differences, but still, in a sense, remain true to your own moral vision? Much of doing anthropology in another culture is not spending time studying the formal events, the grand ceremonies, the things that people plan for. Rather, it's focusing on serendipity. It's the unplanned things that are so telling when you're trying to understand another culture. It's the unexpected things. It's the events that happen. It's the disputes. It's the arguments. It's the fights. It's the day-to-day things that nobody's planned for. That's the really telling moments when you truly learn about a society. If I wanted to study Wheelock College, I could interview students for 2 years to learn all about how they think the rules are that should govern social life on campus. But it would be the unexpected argument in the halls of the dorms that would really illustrate for me what truly is going on at Wheelock College. Serendipity. It's the unplanned things of day-to-day life that are so telling. Another way to think about that is what a famous anthropologist, Malinowski, called the imponderabilia of everyday life. You want to study all the things that the people in that community take for granted, the things they never think twice about, the unremarked upon stuff of daily life, the things that are so much a part of the fabric of their day-to-day activities that it doesn't even occur to them to stop, think, and talk about it. I can't just say to you, tell me about your everyday life, because so many things, so many rules that govern your everyday life are second nature to you. It just wouldn't occur to you to tell me about them because you've never, in a sense, stepped outside of your life to try and see what are the fundamental rules that govern everyday activity. In this photo, you see a man on the right called Sondelebi. He felt himself to be an insulted party. I don't even remember what the dispute was about. And the men on the left are holding a cluster of betel nuts, and they've marched up to Sondelebi, and they're essentially apologizing for having insulted him. Now, this was an impromptu dispute. It was totally unplanned. Frankly, I don't even remember what the dispute was about. But here I learned so much about conflict, about dispute resolution, about what it is to be a moral person, about what you apologize for, how you apologize for things, who assumes responsibility for moral infractions. I would have learned none of this just by interviewing men, because it's so much a part of their lives. You need to focus on the imponderabilia of daily life, and you need to pay attention to serendipity, to the unexpected. This is a marriage transaction, a wedding if you will. The bride goes to the groom's house, and then the groom presents the bride's family with a pig, in this day and age, a carton of beer, and a little bit of money. And if you're wondering about the fate of the pig, here it is. In Yatmal society, a really important relationship is between a man and his nieces and nephews. Specifically, it's between a mother's brother and his sister's children. That is, it would be between you and your mother's brother, that is, your maternal uncle, and between him and his sister's children. It's a particular kind of relationship. It's between one particular kind of uncle and his nieces and nephews. The specifics of the relationship are not particularly important for what I want to talk about, but it's a very important relationship in Yatmal society. This is my sister, and that's her child. In Yatmal culture, the mother's brother, that is the maternal uncle, for me, gives food, particularly chicken and sago. You, the mother's brother, feed your nieces and nephews. In return, your nieces and nephews give you, the mother's brother, valuables. I fed him, the little boy, and in exchange, my sister gave me this basket. Now, this brings up a really important point. How does the anthropologist's presence change or influence the culture? Clearly, your presence is going to have some effect. Are people going to do things a little bit differently? Are they perhaps going to put on a more comprehensive ceremony or ritual because you're there? Are they going to moderate some of what they say? Are they less likely to argue? Or will they do things differently because you're there? You really need to try and pay attention to how your presence influences the culture. That's called the Heisenberg effect, how the anthropologist's presence influences or shapes the culture. When I went back to the village in 2014, the gentleman in this photo, Gambro Miavan, who I've worked with and known for over 20 years, was sick. He just had a kind of lingering illness that he just could not get rid of. What he did one day is took the chicken, which is in the front of the picture, and smacked it against a tree to kill it, and then placed it on the floor of his house. The idea is that the chicken was kind of a sacrifice. The chicken was going to, in a sense, represent the illness that was afflicting him, and by killing the chicken, he was killing the illness. And now he's going to give the chicken to one of his female relatives, who's going to pluck it and cook it and feed it to his nieces and nephews. So, in a nutshell, that's the situation, that's the scene that you're looking at here. How are you going to make sense of this particular scene? What if you have a deep commitment to Western medicine? Are you going to say that this is sad or tragic or silly? I mean, really? This is how he's supposed to cure himself? What if you are a serious animal lover, or perhaps a moral vegetarian or a moral vegan? You might actually be horrified or a little bit disgusted by the fact that this bird has just been so carelessly killed by being whacked against a tree. What if you are deeply empathetic about people and have real difficulty seeing people in pain. And he was actually kind of suffering. He'd been sick for a long time. Surely that will shape your interpretation of this particular scene. What if you're a little bit of a hypochondriac, a little bit germophobic? He was coughing and hacking all over the place. You might feel a little uncomfortable spending too much time with him, worried about perhaps picking up whatever illness it was that he had. So your personality is in very subtle ways going to shape your interpretations of the culture. In fact, you might actually get different anthropologists coming up with completely different interpretations of what's going on in any particular culture because they have very different personalities. You might be an introvert, you might be an extrovert. So you need to pay attention to the Rashomon effect. How are the quirks and the unique attributes of your personality going to shape your conclusions and interpretations about another culture? A men's house in Tambanum. Another men's house, a much smaller one. It is jam-packed full of men, no women. Men discussing a fairly significant political event. It was about whether or not the village should join a provincial or regional culture and tourism show. What I want to emphasize is that this was an event that would impact the entire village, but within the traditional political structure of the society, no women, I repeat, no women had a voice or a say in the planning of this event. This is the newest men's house in the village. It was built a couple of years ago, and quite frankly, it's rather spectacular. And this is one of the things that men do in the men's house. They debate various issues. This is probably the oldest man in the village right now. His name is Karawusameli. And when you debate a political issue inside the men's house, the man who's entitled to speak walks to the center of the building and grabs a bundle of magical leaves. And when he's talking, he slaps the leaves on this stool in order to sort of punctuate and emphasize his oratory. This particular stool is carved with spirit figures. And the same dispute inside the men's house. This is my research assistant or informant, Gambro Miavan. And this brings to mind a very important point about doing ethnography, which is there are always going to be different groups, different opinions within any community. Wheelock, Simmons, IBM, Apple, Sanyo, or a Yatmal village known as Tambanum, no community speaks with a single voice. There's always differences, arguments, competing perspectives. Which perspective is right? How do you wade through the competing notions about social reality? Now, obviously, you sometimes try to represent all perspectives, but sometimes it's a bit, more difficult or confusing. So you need to kind of pay attention to the notions of truth in the village. My general philosophy is everything is true, everything is false. That is to say, everything that people tell you, even the lies, is truthful. That is, sheds some important light on the culture. But everything is false. That is to say, don't necessarily give any statements greater veracity or truth value than other statements. In other words, you're going to go home and make sense of a culture, and you're going to do it largely on the basis of your conversations with your informants and with the general community. Some statements are truthful, some statements are false, some you can't really tell what's true and false. So part of being an anthropologist is wading through competing claims to what is true and what is not. The anthropologist hard at work in the men's house. a nice image of globalization that didn't even occur to me until I got back home and was going through my photos. This is the inside of the men's house. Here is a wonderful spirit carved into a house post. And in the back you can see a guy wearing a Bob Marley shirt with a pot leaf. This is a political debate in the late 1980s. This is a Klan leader, now deceased. His name is Agamoy. Now, Agamoy believed that as a Klan leader, he had privileged insight into all the important information pertaining to the community. What he's holding now is a long stick with individual pegs. Each peg represents one of his clan's myths. The ability to own, to know, and to claim ownership over important myths is one way that men compete for serious political prestige. Religious knowledge, especially knowledge of mythology, is extremely important in this community. You might say in our society, the person who has the most stocks or the largest bank account is the most important from a political perspective. In this community, it's the person, or rather the man, who has the largest stock of legitimate or valid or accepted myths. So Agamoy is a Klan leader, and he knows a lot of mythologies. And Agamoy and a bunch of other men who were sort of affiliated with him relentlessly kept telling me that certain other men were basically jerks, that they were morons, they didn't know anything, that their myths and knowledge was all nonsense, I shouldn't talk to them, I shouldn't listen to them. Now, there's no kind of independent way of verifying the truth or accuracy of these statements. So Agamoy and the men that he would spend time with, they were sort of the established authorities of the village. And they were disparaging other men who were competing for political prominence. So this raises a really important question. What am I supposed to publish? On the one hand, I have a group of accepted leaders who are telling me that everything these other people are saying is nonsense. If I publish everything, then I've violated what some of my trusted informants have told me not to do. Plus, my books and writings do make their way to the village, and so people might get angry at me for having published what they specifically told me not to publish. So you as the anthropologist are trying to present your community that you're studying to the world. What do you publish? What do you talk about? What do you teach to students? What about Yatmul am I supposed to teach you, my students? Only the things that Yatmul want me to tell you? Do I tell you everything I saw and everything I heard? Should I only tell you the good things about the community? Look, all communities, even your own communities, have, the quote-unquote dirty laundry. Nobody likes their community's dirty laundry to be aired to the entire world. Is it my role to somehow present the Yatmul in a good light? Should I tell them only the good things, only the things they want me to tell? Should I run all the information I publish and talk about in my teaching past them for approval? Should I change names? Should I alter the description of events so that people can't be identified? Should I even change the name of the village itself, just in case some information gets back? What if I publish something and the book gets back to the village and I inadvertently, on the basis of what I've written, cause a feud or a fight or a dispute? What if that argument escalates and somebody gets killed? You have to be very careful about the kinds of information you present. Careful not in the sense that you need to censor information, but you need to think about the implications of what you, the anthropologists, are publishing and talking about this community. A healing ceremony. A person living in the house in the background was taken ill, and the owner of that house also is the custodian of this old net, that is woven bag, which is suspended in the center of the photo from a tall stick. This bag was carried by one of the ancestors who in mythology helped create the world. And what these men are doing is chanting names, magical names affiliated with this bag in the hopes of healing the person in the house. Some children dressed up for a ceremony, kids playing cards, another image of globalization, my brother's daughter in a Power Rangers t-shirt. The same child, when I went back in 2010, I brought her a Curious George doll, which she simply loved. It was really her first doll, stuffed toy, kind of modern style toy. And here she is a couple of years later. She's holding two plastic balls, a little doll in her left hand, and a stuffed animal of, I think that's a dog, in her right hand. Of course, these were gifts I gave her. Yams growing at the start of the gardening season. Women making baskets for sale in the market in town. Another image of globalization. Britney Spears next to a spirit carving in the men's house. Starting to make a canoe. Starting to build a house. Globalization again. My sister with a Metallica t-shirt. Woman with fish traps on the way to her canoe. 3 young boys who just found a snack in the forest. They're holding a lizard, a bird, and the slingshot that got both of them. They're now going to start a little fire and enjoy a snack. And you will, of course, recognize the t-shirt in the center. One of the principles of anthropology is that cultures everywhere are not just random heaps and assemblages of disconnected, detached practices, beliefs, and components. Rather, culture is an integrated and functioning totality. But does any culture work better for some folks and not others? In other words, if culture functions, does it function better for some people? What about inequality? This was my brother's house in 2010. It's since been remodeled, but nonetheless, it's basically the same thing. So it's my brother's house, and in the foreground are 2 platforms. On the left is the dishwashing platform of his first wife. On the right is the dishwashing platform of his second wife. In this culture, men can have multiple wives. Women cannot have multiple husbands. They would roar with laughter at the mere suggestion that that would even be a possibility. So is this good? Does it work better for the husband, for my brother, than it does for his wives? Is this just another cultural difference? Is this inequality? Does culture function equally for the 2 women as it does for their one husband? How can we make sense of this in a way that's true to their experiences, but also is true to how we think about the reality of the situation? And one other important issue, is this an example of inequality even if the 2 wives deny it? In other words, is it possible that some people's views of their lives are not fully correct? And are you, as an anthropologist, willing to say that people don't always fully understand their own culture? Going to church. Christianity is part and parcel of the wider colonial enterprise. Christianity was introduced into the Sepik River in the 1930s by missionaries. It's hard to know how to make sense of this. Is it appropriate? Is it moral? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it just is? What do you think about this? What does this say about global inequality, about global power, about history, about colonialism? It's very complicated and not always easy or clear how we should make sense of certain things that we encounter in regard to globalization when we're doing fieldwork in the developing world. The inside of the church. By the way, the roof of this church is made from corrugated tin. It's a metal roof, and it must be 500 degrees in there. And a couple of photos of the village school. In heading back home in 2014, we're now heading from the village downriver, then through a stream, where we're going to meet a car at a newly created dirt road. And the dirt road was created in order for the village to sell some of their land. It's the only asset they have is land. It's a dirt road that was built for the village to sell some of their land, and specifically some of their hardwood trees, to a Malaysian timber company. All this logging is completely illegal, but it's the only way the village views themselves as having any viable source of income. All this logging, again, is illegal. Nobody really knows the name of this company. And even if you knew the name, it's completely fabricated. There's no contracts. There's no sort of legal infrastructure that we have in the United States. And the village has yet to be paid for any of this timber. Where does this timber end up? Well, some of it's going to end up on the furniture that you and I buy when we go to stores in the United States. Frankly speaking, nobody knows where their hardwood trees come from, but it all comes from mostly illegal logging and deforestation in the southwestern Pacific Islands, in the Amazon, in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia. I have no way of knowing if this village is going to get a dime for all of this timber. They might be left with no timber, some ruined land, and no money. It's just one of the tragedies, or possible tragedies, of globalization. Final thought. How do you know that you got it right? How do you know that your study was comprehensive, that you figured out all the relevant puzzles and cultural nuances, that you truly, truly understand the culture? How do you know that you were right? This is the great epistemological problem of anthropology. At what point can you say, I know that culture? And how do you know what you know? The end.